Thank you. I thought I'd kick off what is otherwise a very large topic generally, which we could spend a lot of time talking about. And certainly when we put together the last issue, we realised, we could use a lot more pages discussing education, particularly at the moment, I think, and also the form that urban design education in particular could take. But I thought it might be useful for us to remind ourselves about why we do need an urban design education, on the basis that I suspect I'm preaching to the converted. But let's not lose sight of the fact there are an awful lot of unconverted people out there. So hopefully I won't tell you too much about what you already sort of know about the rest of our professional colleagues and the public. But remind ourselves, I think, about the fact that the work is not yet done, clearly. Just a tiny bit about the Urban Renaissance Institute. It was founded by the University of Greenwich and CEDA, and part of the Regional Centre of Excellence, to effectively do education. We do training, literally urban design training, and taking people through very practical things. We do research and also consultancy. So it's very much an educational sort of organisation, but it's outward facing, so we don't work with students, we only work with grown-ups, is how I like to think about it. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about whether you agree with this. In fact, this has been an interesting observation for an urban design group study tour. Anyway. It's very easy to forget, of course, that architects and town planners still don't speak the same language. These are two places from Maidenhead, would you believe, picked at random, but actually both regarded as really good solutions to difficult design problems. And amazingly, the architect of the, would you believe it, a ginormous car park on the far side over there, is really very proud of that piece of work and thinks that he's done a marvellous job. And actually, what's interesting is that clearly nobody had the skills to be able to have a discussion about whether that was actually a good solution or not. So it seems to me that, if nothing else, urban design is very much about bridging the gap between these two very important groups of people who are still not speaking the same language, or perhaps deliberately misunderstanding each other, maybe, I don't know. It also strikes me that, and I often sort of, I've stopped doing it actually, go through BD each week and look for current projects and see what I think about them. And this is something quite historic, I have to admit, from Barking Reach. But it alarmed me that this was the vision for one of the key spaces in Barking Reach. And this is actually what the architectural vision for this new place would look like. It does make me think it's the emperor's new clothes in many of these situations, where an awful lot of the clients may not necessarily feel that they're in a position to be able to say what they think about what they're seeing, but actually an awful lot of us might be able to feel we could comment very differently given a chance. And it's interesting, I think, with the market being what it is, the extent to which we're seeing architects moving into urban design, and whether they are actually still speaking the old language or whether they're speaking what is effectively common ground language, but we'll see whether that is the case too. And this isn't by any means a pop at Macrina Lavington at all, but I also found this, and you can see 2006, so this isn't exactly yesterday's news, but this is the vision for Basildon, and I don't know Basildon terribly well, but I suspect that the last thing they need is lots more buildings, which are all incredibly similar, but the only way you know what's in them is by having a label on them. And this is the vision, this is what these people would have to look forward to as home for presumably several years to come. And it strikes me that actually so many of the really basic principles that I was brought up with, if you like, in responsive environments, have clearly never really been put to use in sort of building visions of these sorts of places. Particularly, I think, when you've got to have things written on the street so you know which way quite key public facilities actually are from where you are at the station. So it strikes me that leaving it to the architects isn't necessarily a good solution. Again, and I've stopped doing it. I must say, I've stopped going through BD and winding myself up. But, it's very interesting when you see different visions of actually what is represented as new, really good sorts of examples of design, and whether that represents anything that I would like to live in or work in or go to. And I can't say that I do with any of these examples. This was one which, and I had done a sort of series of talks to groups of Americans, and what was very interesting, and I found this example specifically for that. And again, this is, you could see centerfold in BD this came from. This is the last one, I think. But how interesting that, I'm sure this art museum is a really fascinating and fantastic facility for this particular town. But at the same time, clearly somebody forgot to write the brief which actually had anything to do with urban design in it. Or if they did, I can't understand how this might satisfy that. I'm sure it's fantastic and all the rest of it inside, but to me there's an awful lot missing in there, and I can't believe that I'd be the only person that would feel that way. What's also interesting, of course, is that you don't get very strong urban design critique. Again, from building design, this is a scheme in Leicester. I think it's New John Lewis scheme in Leicester, where there was a lot written about very nice curly patterns on the facades of the buildings, which were basically there to mask the fact that it's got lots of blank facades. But how rare it is that you can actually pick up articles which really do a genuine urban design critique of places that are currently being built. If people are interested in doing that, we would love to receive them. I think we would do it, but we would probably give ourselves high blood pressure getting involved in doing critiques. But it's something that I think needs to happen more and more, because otherwise we only ever have a discussion about places that are nice, as opposed to places that actually haven't worked, or where some really fundamental things have been left behind. It also strikes me that there are lots of other different areas that urban design is not engaging with. The dash for trash was something, I can't think, it was Alan Cherry that mentioned it, in terms of the whole MMC and methods of mass construction, I think it is, or something like that. And the extent to which that whole design process is happening, and yet who's thinking about the context and the sense of place that goes with all of that, or whether it's happening and the industry will be getting on with it, but actually urban design is not engaging with that because of the sense of it being mass produced, and therefore there isn't time to stop and have those sort of little intricate debates that urban designers might want to have. It also strikes me, and this is a diagram that I'm sure all of you know, it also strikes me that actually at the top half of the diagram, what we've actually got is what industry has created in terms of all these typologies, and we're not born knowing this stuff. We invariably have to learn it as part of practice. And actually what we should be doing is keeping that kind of convention out of our mindset, so that we continually reassess how different urban forms and different land uses and all those sorts of things come back together in terms of urban places. And it strikes me that actually what happens to an awful lot of people when they first join practice particularly, and I've worked in consultancy for a long time as well as doing URI, is that actually one of the first things that people are really immersed in is an awful lot of object or industry typology design, when actually the beauty of graduates is they don't have all of that baggage and all of those standards ingrained in them, and that should be something that we think about much more. And of course, a lack of structure is something which pops up all the time. This is the Urban Task Force report, probably 10 years old now. And yet it's incredible how rare this whole sense of urban structure actually does get brought out quite clearly in an awful lot of projects. The logic, the underlying logic and context are just not clearly set out. And to an awful lot of people, I suspect that that's only something that you come across if you do something like urban design and planning. But if you come through any other sort of design route, you're not necessarily going to be working in such a rational and structured fashion, I would argue. Again, I think this is a similar diagram from Urban Task Force report. I think there's an issue there, which probably hasn't helped, about what we call urban designers or master planners. Urban designers, and I remember when I worked for Scott Wilson for quite some time, and I remember when I joined there was a lot of discussion within the company as to whether we were doing master planning or whether we were doing urban design. And I was saying, well, actually, I think it's urban design. Oh, well, that's just the streets and the pavements and, details. No, actually, I'm an architect by background, therefore I'm looking at massing and volume. Well, then in that case, that's master planning. Well, no, it isn't, because master planning to me, and so it was and I don't think we cracked it. And I think I ended up being called, whatever it was, director of master planning and urban design, because we couldn't agree what it was. And I wasn't prepared for it to be defined too tightly so that it could then be kind of ignored. But it strikes me that, even in key diagrams like that, which recognises the fundamental role of what an urban designer can do, calling it a master planner automatically means something which is much more, I think, about making a product than it is about the process. And it seems to me that process and product are the two things that urban designers specifically do, which maybe other disciplines around it don't do. So I think there's a lot to be done by way of clarification. It also strikes me on the whole environmental agenda and the need, I think, to get to grips with environmental design sort of principles, the need for urban design to have a good debate and a detailed and rigorous debate with other disciplines about actually how we resolve some of the issues around flooding or orientation, all those sorts of things. I think, occasionally people get involved with it, or it's it's a toe in the water, and realise there are some quite conflicting ideas in what represents good design and street level and all those different sorts of things. But I'm not sure whether we've come out with a particularly strong statement about that as a set of urban designers. Perhaps I'm wrong, I don't know. Design Champions is a group that we've done things with, and it's a fascinating idea. You know, this one person in a council, or maybe two if you're particularly lucky, who is probably a member, maybe an officer, maybe you have both. And it's your job really to bring excellence in design to everything that your council does, or at least encourage other people to consider design, at all. And what's very interesting, I think, about that particular sort of set of groups, in a way, is actually the sense to which people understand what their role is to begin with. It's a fundamental responsibility and a fundamental role, and yet most councillors who are in that position don't necessarily see what it is they're supposed to be doing, and therefore how hard it is for them to go on and persuade other people that they've got something that's worth listening to. I think there is so much, again, and I feel like I write lots of lists of things that need to be done and don't necessarily go away and do anything about it myself. But there's so much to be done, I think, by way of actually taking design into the middle of a council rather than it being a design champion. By default, that sounds a slightly marginal role. But also something which I haven't yet managed to do, but I'm sure I will with design champions, is have a discussion about the role of party politics, particularly in the built environment, and why, what is it that one party would particularly say about the built environment that another one might fundamentally disagree with. And I'm not sure that I've yet figured out where politics really does matter in the built environment. Education, health, all those sorts of other things, I can understand where the differences are, but I can't see it for the built environment myself. And it hasn't yet it's not obvious talking to design champions where they're coming from and actually which colour party they particularly are aligned with. Not obvious at all. And I think the other thing which is important about design champions and the extent to which they are supported by an organisation like ours, is also then the importance of their role to officers who are either in a very sort of minority position, if you like, within an authority, or as somebody who may not necessarily feel that they've actually got the skills to be asked to be the design champion and cover such an enormous topic. So I think that that whole sense of giving people a badge and then expecting them to be able to do something really big with it is something that urban design hasn't yet recognised in terms of how critical that is as an influencing position, particularly. There are all sorts of different ways in which local authorities actually should be taking the initiative now, where I suspect for a long time people haven't been able to take initiative in the way that developers have been operating. I've been doing work earlier this year with CEDA and the HCA on the extent to which local authorities can actually now enable affordable housing to happen as a result of using their own assets and their own skills and taking leadership on that front. And it's been very interesting for us to see the extent to which councillors are prepared to roll their sleeves up and get into doing innovative things, but actually, and developers naturally are very keen to get involved in that discussion as well and see, how schemes can be rescued. But the extent to which officers are actually hanging back quite a lot because they are expected to have the technical know-how to follow through, and yet nobody's necessarily giving them that support in order to help the leadership deliver what they want. So there's an interesting point there. Having thought about all these different, councillor groups, I'm always frustrated by the sense that, each time there's an election or whatever, wherever it happens to be, there's a new intake and you almost start all over again. And it's a bit of a sort of a mindless task in some ways. And wouldn't it be good to influence people before they got to the point of being a councillor so that it's actually part and parcel of how people live? And it strikes me, and the image of the guy on the skateboard was one from... it was from a back issue that we did, and it was all about Skate MK, and it was it was about the fact that there were skaters everywhere and how awful it was, and they needed to be kind of given projects and spaces in order to be able to go on and do what they did, and how interesting it was that in so many projects that I've come across, one of the first things that you have as part of the brief is we have so many skaters and they're all over the town centre and we don't want that anymore, we want to put them to one side. And how interesting and funny it might be to look back in 10-15 years time to see whether any of those sorts of uses for public space significantly alter how we think public space ought to be being used, and actually whether any of these sort of public space users now will get involved in shaping the kind of environment that clearly they actually want, as opposed to being put in a park somewhere around the corner. So I've been trying to work on a programme to look at the next generation of councillors, in a sense, which is what I've been calling here the public understanding of development. But so far, I think it's a very large task. So it strikes me that what urban design actually has to offer is that we develop good critical and creative skills. Of course, a lot of people don't appreciate that actually it's not just about the architectural appreciation side of things. Urban design training is so much more rounded than that, and yet an awful lot of people really appreciate the whole idea of architecture and how you make use of those sorts of skills, but haven't yet thought about how much broader they can make that. Another area where I think we're only now beginning to see the gaps, in a way, is on development viability and the extent to which people are actually really familiar with how developers work, how things stack up for them. If they don't stack up, how are they going to sort of deal with that? And I think, bringing designers much closer to the money is a really important strand, which, I think I've only learned subsequently. I certainly didn't have that as part of my formal education. And another thing which we've come across a lot in terms of the delivery sort of programs that we've done to sort of support organisations whose job it is to deliver growth areas or whatever, is the fact that making things happen skills, as they've described them, are personal. They're not things which are currently being taught, and it's whether those are things which can be being taught or whether they can just be unearthed, or whether it really very much comes down to people's personality, which enables them to actually take the initiative where others might not. This is just this is a reminder for ourselves in terms of how we work, but also I kind of offer it up to you in a sense of, urban designers are actually in a whole range of different sorts of roles and can influence all different sorts of stages, and yet we're not necessarily overtly teaching people or encouraging people to think maybe about how they need to work with other people. It seems to be things which happen, the penny drops several years later perhaps for others. I won't sort of spend too much time thinking about how we do those things, and I know others will come on and talk about sort of the importance of lifelong learning and sort of generally different ways of learning. But it is interesting, and I'll wrap up with this, to think about Egan's generic skills list and the extent to which an awful lot of these generic skills are actually also what I would see as urban design skills, and whether other people recognise urban designers as having those skills, or whether we are just the people who do a bit of paving in between big buildings. I'll leave it at that and hand it over.
Thanks very much.